All right, join me in the exploration of the concluding passages from G.K. Chesterton's The Everlasting Man. We're going to do a close reading here and reflect on some of these beautiful summarizing passages from this wonderful book. And the context is we're going to be looking at what is this story of man? Who is man, given the different various world views and perspectives that history has laid upon us. First, we're going to look at man in terms of evolutionary, from the evolutionary perspective versus man and beast. And then we're going to reflect on man in his interpretation through the philosophical traditions and through the religious traditions, the pagan traditions, and ultimately, what is this strange story that we in the West and in the world are a part of God being made man, or God taking flesh and entering history at a certain point in time? This is a utterly unique situation that we have found ourselves in historically. There are many other kinds of deities and other kinds of examples of messengers and emissaries of the divine coming to earth and teaching and edifying mankind. But there's a very unique function and situation in the story of our Lord Jesus Christ, the second person of the Trinity, taking on the flesh and the personhood of mankind at a certain point in history and transforming reality itself. So there's only a few passages here, but they're absolutely wonderful and beautiful to contemplate. So join me here as we get started. In the land lit by the neighboring star, whose blaze is the broad daylight, there are many and various things motionless and moving. There moves among them a race that is, in its relation to others, a race of gods. He's talking about mankind here. The fact is not lessened, but emphasized because it could behave like a race of demons. Its distinction is not an individual illusion, like one bird pluming itself on its own plumes. It is a solid and many-sided thing. It is demonstrated in the very speculations that have led to its being denied. That men, the gods of this lower world, are linked within it in various ways is true, but it is another aspect of the same truth. That they grow as the grass grows and walk as the beasts walk is a secondary necessity that sharpens the primary distinction. It is like saying that a magician must after all have the appearance of a man, or that even the fairies could not dance without feet. It has lately been the fashion to focus the mind entirely on these mild and subordinate resemblances and to forget the main fact altogether. It is customary to insist that man resembles the other creatures. So here we go. We're juxtaposing again the evolutionary and biological interpretation of man. Yes, in the very resemblance he alone can see. So this resemblance of man with the other creatures is something that man alone can observe. He continues, the fish does not trace the fishbone pattern in the fowls of the air, or the elephant and the emu compare skeletons. Even in the sense in which man is at one with the universe, it is an utterly lonely universality. The very sense that he is united with all things is enough to sunder him from all. And now here we go, a footnote pushing this line of exploration. Chesterton enjoys expounding on the strange juxtaposition of man and beast. Quote, if you leave off looking at books about beasts and men, if you begin to look at beasts and men, then, if you have any humor or imagination, any sense of the frantic or the farcical, you will observe that the startling thing is not how like man is to the brutes, but how unlike he is. It is the monstrous scale of his divergence that requires explanation. That man and brute are like is, in a sense, a truism. But that being so like they should then be so insanely unlike, that is the shock and the enigma. That an ape has hands is far less interesting to the philosopher than the fact that having hands he does next to nothing with them, does not play knucklebones or the violin, does not carve marble or carve mutton. People talk of barbaric architecture and debased art. But elephants do not build colossal temples of ivory even in a Rococo style. Camels do not paint even bad pictures, though equipped with the material of many camels' hair brushes. Certain modern dreamers say that ants and bees have a society superior to ours. They have indeed a civilization, but that very truth only reminds us that it is an inferior civilization. Whoever found an anthill decorated with the statues of celebrated ants? Who has seen a beehive carved with the images of gorgeous queens of old? No, the chasm between man and other creatures may have natural explanation, but it is indeed a chasm. We talk of wild animals, but man is the only wild animal. It is man that has broken out. All other animals are tame animals, following the rugged respectability of the tribe or type. All other animals are domestic animals. Man alone is ever undomestic, either as a profligate or a monk. So that this first superficial reason for materialism is, if anything, a reason for its opposite. It is exactly where biology leaves off that all religion begins. Close quote. Back to the text here. Looking around him by his unique light, as lonely as the literal flame that he alone has kindled, this demigod or demon of the visible world makes the world visible. He sees around him a world of a certain style or type. It seems to proceed by certain rules, or at least repetitions. He sees a green architecture that builds itself without visible hands, but which builds itself into a very exact plan or pattern, like a design already drawn in the air by an invisible finger. All right, now we're going to get into this juxtaposition of man in terms of religion and philosophy. It is not, as in now vaguely suggested, a vague thing. It is not a growth or a groping of blind life. Each seeks an end, a glorious and radiant end, even for every daisy or dandelion we see in looking across the level of a common field. In the very shape of things, there is more than green growth. There is the finality of the flower. It is a world of crowns. I like to think of this idea that what is the telos of a flower but to bloom, right? And the flower in its blooming is its own unique ability to worship God. It reaches to the heaven and then unfurls its crown. Its apotheosis is to bloom its beautiful colors, its wonderful fragrances, in its worship of the divine creator of all things. All right, back to the text here. This impression, whether or not it be illusion, has profoundly influenced this race of thinkers and masters of the material world, that the vast majority have been moved to take a certain view of that world. They have concluded, rightly or wrongly, that the world had a plan, as the tree seemed to have a plan, and an end and a crown like the flower. But so long as the race of thinkers was able to think, it was obvious that the admission of this idea of a plan brought with it another thought more thrilling and even terrible. There was someone else, some strange and unseen being who had designed these things, if indeed they were designed. There was a stranger who was also a friend, a mysterious benefactor who had been before them and built up the woods and hills for their coming, and had kindled the sunrise against their rising, as a servant kindles a fire. Now this idea of a mind that gives a meaning to the universe has received more and more confirmation within the minds of men, by meditations and experiences much more subtle and searching than any such argument about the external plan of the world. But I am concerned here with the keeping the story in its most simple and even concrete terms. And it is enough to say here that most men, including the wisest men, have come to the conclusion that the world has such a final purpose and therefore such a first cause. But most men, in some sense, separated themselves from the wisest men when it came to the treatment of that idea. There came into existence two ways of treating that idea, which between them make up most of the religious history of the world. And now we're going to explore these two ways of treating this idea in terms of world religions. The majority, like the minority, had this strong sense of a second meaning in things, of a strange master who knew the secret of the world. But the majority, the mob or mass of men, naturally tended to treat it rather in the spirit of gossip. The gossip, like all gossip, contained a great deal of truth and falsehood. The world began to tell itself tales about the unknown being or his sons or servants or messengers. Some of the tales may truly be called old wives' tales, as professing only to be very remote memories of the morning of the world, myths about the baby moon or the half-baked mountains. Some of them might more truly be called travelers' tales, as being curious but contemporary tales brought from certain borderlands of experience, such as miraculous cures or those that bring whispers of what happened to the dead. Many of them are probably true tales. Enough of them are probably true to keep a person of real common sense more or less conscious that there really is something rather marvelous behind the cosmic curtain. But in a sense, it is only going by appearances, even if the appearances are called apparitions. It is a matter of appearances and disappearances. At the most, these gods are ghosts, that is, they are glimpses. For most of us, they are rather gossip about glimpses. And for the rest, the whole world is full of rumors, most of which are almost avowedly romances. The great majority of the tales about gods and ghosts and the invisible king are told, if not for the sake of the tale, at least for the sake of the topic. They are evidence of the eternal interest of the theme. They are not evidence of anything else, and they are not meant to be. They are mythology or poetry that is not bound in books or bound in any other way. Meanwhile, the minority, the sages or thinkers, had withdrawn apart and had taken up an equally congenial trade. They were drawing up plans of the world which all believed to have a plan. They were trying to set forth the plan seriously and to scale. They were setting their minds directly to the mind that had made the mysterious world, considering what sort of mind it might be and what its ultimate purpose might be. So now we're getting into the scientific paradigm, right? This objective way of thinking. Some of them made that mind much more impersonal than mankind has generally made it. Some simplified it almost to a blank. A very few, doubted it altogether. Bringing in the atheist perspective here, right? One or two of the more morbid fancied that it might be evil and an enemy. Just one or two of the more degraded in the other class worshiped demons instead of gods. But most of these theorists were theists, and they not only saw a moral plan in nature, but they generally laid down a moral plan for humanity. Most of them were good men who did good work, and they were remembered and reverenced in various ways. They were scribes, and their scriptures became more or less holy scriptures. They were lawgivers, and their tradition became not only legal but ceremonial. We may say that they received divine honors in the sense in which kings and great captains in certain countries often received divine honors. In a word, wherever the other popular spirit, the spirit of the legend and gossip, could come into play, it surrounded them with the more mystical atmosphere of the myths. Popular poetry turned the sages into saints. But that was all it did. They reminded themselves men never really forget that they were men, only made into gods, in the sense that they were made into heroes. Divine Plato, like divine Caesar, was a title and not a dogma. In Asia, where the atmosphere was more mythological, the man was made to look more like a myth, but he remained a man. He remained a man of a certain social class or school of men, receiving and deserving great honor from mankind. It is the order or school of the philosophers, the men who have set themselves seriously to trace the order across any apparent chaos in the vision of life. Instead of living on imaginative rumors and remote traditions, and the tail end of exceptional experiences about the mind and meaning behind the world, they have tried in a sense to project the primary purpose of that mind a priori. They have tried to put on paper a possible plan of the world, almost as if the world were not yet made. And now we're getting into the strange story of the coming into the world of the Christian soul. Right in the middle of these things stands up an enormous exception. It is quite like anything else. It is a thing final like the trump of doom, though it is also a piece of good news, or news that seems too good to be true. It is nothing less than a loud assertion that this mysterious maker of the world has visited his world in person. It declares that really and even recently, or right in the middle of historic times, there did walk into the world this original invisible being, about whom the thinkers make theories and the mythologists hand down myths. The man who made the world. That such a higher personality exists behind all things had indeed always been implied by all the best thinkers, as well as by all the most beautiful legends. But nothing of this sort had ever been implied in any of them. It is simply false to say that the other sages and heroes had claimed to be that mysterious master and maker of whom the world had dreamed and disputed. Not one of them had ever claimed to be anything of the sort. Not one of their sects or schools had ever claimed that they had claimed to be anything of the sort. The most that any religious prophet had said was that he was the true servant of such a being. The most that any visionary had ever said was that men might catch glimpses of the glory of that spiritual being, or much more often of lesser spiritual beings. This makes me think of the devas and the Hindu gods, and we think of all of these instantiations of these avatars of spiritual beings and deities. The sheer uniqueness of the story of the creator of the universe actually taking form in history, the actual creator of the universe taking form in history, in space and time, and revealing himself and transforming the world, is an utterly unique Christian phenomenon. The most that any primitive myth had ever suggested was that the creator was present in the creation, but that the creator was present at scenes a little subsequent to the supper parodies of Horace, and talked with tax collectors and government officials in the detailed daily life of the Roman Empire, and that this fact continued to be firmly asserted by the whole of that great civilization for more than 1,000 years. That is something utterly like anything else in nature. It is the one great startling statement that man has made since he spoke his first articulate word instead of barking like a dog. Its unique character can be used as an argument against it as well as for it. It would be easy to concentrate on it as a case of isolated insanity. So this is the idea that maybe this person that came to claim that he was the Son of Man, the Son of God, was just insane. What would that claim would blink in and out of history like a blink of an eye. This is the point that he's going to make here. Back, he says, it would be easy to concentrate on it as the case of isolated insanity, but it makes nothing but dust and nonsense of comparative religion. It came on the world with the wind and rush of running messengers proclaiming the apocalyptic portent, and it is not unduly fanciful to say that they are running still. What puzzles the world and its wise philosophers and fanciful pagan poets about the priests and people of the Catholic Church is that they still behave as if they were messengers. A messenger does not dream about what his message might be, or argue about what it probably would be. He delivers it as it is. It is not a theory or a fancy, but a fact. It is not relevant to this intentionally rudimentary outline to provide in detail that it is a fact, but merely to point out that these messengers do deal with it as men deal with the fact. The messengers, of course, are the angels. All that is condemned in the Catholic tradition, authority, and dogmatism, and the refusal to retract and modify are but the natural human attributes of a man with a message relating to a fact. I desire to avoid in this last summary all the controversial complexities that may once more cloud the simple lines of that strange story, which I have already called, in words that are much too weak, the strangest story of the world. I desire merely to mark those main lines, and especially to mark where the great line is really to be drawn. The religion of the world, in its right proportions, is not divided into fine shades of mysticism or more or less rational forms of mythology. It is divided by the line between the men who are bringing that message and the men who have not yet heard it or cannot yet believe it. But when we translate the terms of that strange tale back into the more concrete and complicated terminology of our time, we find it covered by names and memories of which the very familiarity is a falsification. For instance, when we say that a country contains so many Muslims, we really mean that it contains so many monotheists. And we really mean by that it contains so many men. Men with the old average assumption of men, that the invisible ruler remains invisible. They hold it along with the customs of a certain culture and under the simple laws of a certain lawgiver. But so they would if their lawgiver was Lycurgus or Solon. They testify to something which is necessary and noble truth, but was never a new truth. Their creed is not a new color. It is the neutral and normal tint that is in the background of the many-colored life of man. Muhammad did not, like the Magi, find a new star. He saw through his own particular window a glimpse of the great gray field of the ancient starlight. So when we say the country contains so many Confucians or Buddhists, we mean it contains so many pagans whose prophets have given them another and rather vaguer version of the invisible power, making it not only invisible, but almost impersonal. When we say that they also have temples and idols, and priests and periodic festivals, we simply mean that this sort of heathen is enough of a human being to admit the popular element of pomp and pictures and feasts and fairy tales. Here's a footnote, quote, "Fairy tales seem to me to be entirely reasonable things," says Chesterton. "They are not fantasies. Compared with them, other things are fantastic. Compared with them, religion and rationalism are both abnormal, though religion is abnormally right and rationalism abnormally wrong. Fairyland is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. It is not earth that judges heaven, but heaven that judges earth." Close quote. We only mean that pagans have more sense than the Puritans. So he states, but we only mean that the pagans have more sense than Puritans. So footnote on the Puritans here. Quote, "Pagans were wiser than paganism. That is why pagans became Christians. The Puritans largely succeeded in destroying the belief in saints and encouraging the belief in witches." Close quote. Very interesting to reflect on that. Back to the text. "But what the gods are supposed to be, what the priests are commissioned to say, is not sensational secret like those running messengers of the gospel had to say." Footnote. Chesterton is referring to a little-known scripture passage from one of the minor prophets, quote, "And the Lord answered me, write the vision, make it plain upon tablets, so he may run who reads it. For still the vision awaits its time. It hastens to the end. It will not lie. If it seems slow, wait for it. It surely will come. It will not delay." This is a prophetic reference to the gospel which is to come. There is urgency in the message, but also simplicity in it, so that, quote, he may run who reads it, or he who runs may read it, a message that must be delivered because it is indeed good news. Back to the text here. Nobody else except those messengers has any gospel. Nobody else has any good news, for the simple reason that nobody else has any news. Those runners gather impetus as they run. Ages afterwards, they still speak as if something had just happened. They have not lost the speed and momentum of messengers. They have hardly lost, as it were, the wild eyes of witnesses. In the Catholic Church, which is the cohort of the message, there are still those headlong acts of holiness that speak of something rapid and recent, a self-sacrifice that startles the world like a suicide. But it is not a suicide. It is not pessimistic. It is still optimistic. It is still as optimistic as St. Francis of the flowers and the birds. It is newer in spirit than the newest schools of thought, and it is almost certainly on the eve of new triumphs. For these men serve a mother who seems to grow more beautiful as new generations rise up and call her blessed. And I love this part here. We might sometimes fancy that the church grows younger as the world grows old. For this is the last proof of the miracle, that something so supernatural should have become so natural. I mean that anything so unique when seen from the outside should only seem universal when seen from the inside. I have not minimized the scale of the miracle, as some of the milder theologians think it wise to do. Rather, I have deliberately dwelt on the incredible interruption as a blow that broke the very backbone of history. I have great sympathy with monotheists, the Muslims or the Jews, to whom it seems a blasphemy that might shake the world. But it did not shake the world, it steadied the world. The fact, the more we consider it, will seem more solid and more strange. I think it a piece of plain justice to all the unbelievers to insist upon the audacity of the act of faith that is demanded of them. I willingly and warmly agree that it is in itself a suggestion at which we might expect even the brain of the believer to reel when he realized his own belief. But the brain of the believer does not reel. It is the brains of the unbeliever that reel, unbelievers that reel. We can see their brains reeling on every side into every extravagance of ethics and psychology, into pessimism and the denial of life, into pragmatism and the denial of logic, seeking their omens and nightmares and their canons and contradictions, shrieking for fear at the far-off sight of things beyond good and evil, or whispering of strange stars where 2 and 2 make 5. Meanwhile, this solitary thing that seems at first so outrageous in outline remains solid and sane in substance. It remains the moderator of all these manias, rescuing reason from the pragmatists exactly as it rescued laughter from the Puritans. I repeat that I have deliberately emphasized its intrinsically defiant and dogmatic character. The mystery is how anything so startling should have remained defiant and dogmatic and yet become perfectly normal and natural. I have admitted freely that, considering the incident in itself, a man who says he is God may be classed with a man who says he is glass. But the man who says he is glass is not a glazer, making windows for all the world. He does not remain for after ages as a shining crystalline figure in whose light everything is as clear as crystal. But this madness has remained sane. This madness of the Christian story throughout the ages has remained sane. I think this is poignant for our time when we're looking for a return back to common sense. What is the root cause of common sense? What is the origin story of common sense? Something to reflect on. But this madness has remained sane. The madness has remained sane when everything else went mad. The madhouse has been a house to which age after age men are continually coming back as to a home. This is the riddle that remains, that anything so abrupt and abnormal should still be found a habitable and hospitable thing. I care not if the skeptic says it's a tall story. I cannot see how so toppling a tower could stand so long without foundation. Still less can I see how it could become, as it has become, the home of man. Had it merely appeared and disappeared, it might possibly have been remembered or explained as the last leap of the rage of illusion, the ultimate myth of the ultimate mood in which the mind struck the sky and broke. But the mind did not break. It is the one mind that remains unbroken in the breakup of the world. It is the one mind that remains unbroken in the breakup of the world. If it were an error, it seems as if the error could hardly have lasted a day. If it were mere ecstasy, it would seem that such an ecstasy could not endure for an hour. It has endured for nearly 2,000 years, and the world within it has been more lucid, more level-headed, more reasonable in its hopes, more healthy in its instincts, more humorous and cheerful in the face and fate and death than all the world outside. For it was the soul of Christendom that came forth from the incredible Christ. The soul of it was common sense. Though we dared not look on his face, we could look on his fruits, and by his fruits we should know him. The fruits are solid, and the fruitfulness is much more than a metaphor. And nowhere in this sad world are boys happier in apple trees, or men in more equal chorus singing as they tread the vine, than under the fixed flash of this instant and intolerant enlightenment, the lightning made eternal as the light. Thanks for listening.